Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining Mike and myself for our first webinar of 2019. My name is Paul Smith. I'm the founder and CEO of the Future Directors Institute. Before I introduce Michael, a little bit more about us and the School Governance Network. The School Governance Network was started by Michael and myself last year. We aim to provide tools, strategies, and news to a network of dedicated school governors around the world who are personally invested in school communities that nurture the best learning environments for all learners, that's students, staff, and parents alike. First and foremost, though, we hope you use this network as a governance orientation resource. Now, if you are interested, sorry, just skipping too far forward there. If you are interested in watching our previous webinars from last year or our newscasts, we do monthly webinars and monthly newscasts, nice quick 15-20 minute news through the lens of the boardroom. Or we've also created some fantastic content which we've either written ourselves or created from the interweb. Then please check out either our LinkedIn group. Many of you who are already members of that LinkedIn group, and you just need to request to join and we'll say yes. Or check out our YouTube channel. Now, also, as we go through this webinar, we'll hopefully be taking questions from you all, and I'll be keeping an eye on that while Michael's presenting and just coming in now and again with the questions if they're pertinent. Otherwise, we'll be keeping some of the questions to the very end of the presentation for a bit of a Q&A. Before, again, I introduce Michael, just a little bit of an overview and context of where we're at. So, in previous webinars, we've described a simple 9-step process for building an effective board of directors or a governance body. And we've been through certain elements of this, including how to find the best governors, how to communicate more effectively internally. But today is all around step 9 and specifically the evaluation and board health checks. And on that note, I will introduce Michael Iannini, who will be presenting the board health check today, and I'll let him introduce himself. Michael, over to you.
All right, thanks, Paul. For those of you that have been kind of following us these last 6 months on this journey, really exploring the in and outs of governance, and I mean, to be honest, we've only touched the surface. Hopefully you would have gotten a fairly good introduction to Paul and myself through reading our bios or going to our websites. But just a quick recap, I'm a Council of International Schools affiliated consultant that specializes in leadership, governance, and organizational development for schools. School governance is really at the heart of everything that I do because it's where the school is probably, in terms of its culture, is influenced the most. And at the same time, it's probably one of the areas that has the least amount of focus in terms of attention for development, organizational practices, evaluation. So at this particular time, what we're going to be looking at today is we're going to be going through, why should we be conducting these board evaluations? Why should we be making this more of a formal process? Now, for many of you probably joining today, you're thinking, well, I already believe we should, but I just want to kind of go through the whys and specifically how that why is influenced by outside stakeholders, namely accreditation bodies. So we're going to be looking at accreditation bodies and their requirements for the board. 2 is what I like to call look-fors. For the educators out there that do data analysis protocols, look-fors obviously are those things that, when you go into any sort of evaluation process or analysis process, what are people looking for? So again, I'm going to provide that perspective coming from other stakeholders. What are other stakeholders looking for in terms of board performance so that we can report appropriately and make more transparent the work that we do? We're going to move into then identifying those stakeholders. So I'm going to introduce a tool called stakeholder mapping and give you kind of a rough idea about how that's done and what it looks like, because your evaluation really needs to touch on the fact of not only those look-fors, but specifically we're going to be looking at the relative importance for those look-fors. there is some valuation feedback that is important coming from our suppliers, just as much as say from our parents. But how do you weight the difference between suppliers and parents in the evaluation process? Next, we're looking at introducing a tool for evaluating board performance. This is a tool that I've used for several years now called the Board Health Check. I'll go into very deep detail about what that involves, and I'll even share a case study at the end with a school that went through the whole board evaluation process with me, the Chinese International School of Hong Kong. So you'll get not only insight into the process itself and a look at some of the tools, but we'll also share a case study for a school that went through the process and what they got coming out of it. With that said, Paul, if you think we're ready, I'll kind of start going into the content.
Yeah, before we do, I'd love to ask a question of the people who are watching today, and just ask generally, like, who actually has a formal or informal board evaluation process in place? And if they want to type into the chat box if they have one, if it's formal or informal, how often do they do it? That'd be great just to see some of those come through. I'll give people a couple of seconds just to type some stuff in.
Yeah, while they're thinking about that, one of the things that that I kind of focus on as we go through this process too is it's amazing how many boards I don't see engaged in a formal process, not even informal, largely because they're very time starved, and at the same time too they're volunteers. So it's not uncommon for boards to not engage in a formal evaluation process for those two specific reasons. But hey, in the interest of time, would you mind if I start kicking it off? And as people,
no, if we see people type in, a lot of people are coming through. I know people have said they were going to be coming through their mobile, so they might not be straight onto their chat stuff. So let's just crack on.
Yep. The next slide is what I want to focus on as evaluation, and what I believe at the heart of evaluation. And if you could just click about one more time, two more, there's one more. There we go, perfect. What I feel is at the heart of any board evaluation is that we have, values, beliefs, behaviors, missions. For those of you that know Jim Collins, you'll be looking at what looks like the hedgehog model. At the heart of every evaluation, what we're looking at is, are we truly measuring our mission, and what is our performance relative to that mission? And that mission needs to infuse those values. Why do we do what we do? Those beliefs, what will we do? And the behaviors, how will we do it? And in order to have an effective evaluation, my beliefs and what I develop tools around is that they need to be purpose driven. So Paul, you could just go to the next slide. I want to give everybody an example of what that board purpose looks like. Now, a lot of schools have their vision and mission statement, and many try to live by that statement throughout the organization, right down to the non-academic staff, who will have a really hard time articulating that mission in terms of what their role or job is. The first thing I instruct any team in a school to do, and the board is just as much a team as the grade 7 team. I instruct them to have their own purpose statement that articulates the mission in terms of what they believe their role is for carrying out that mission, achieving it. So here's an example of a mission statement for the board: to ensure the long-term viability and be good stewards of the school's resources. We think individually and act collectively to focus on the big picture, manage boundaries, and monitor performance. That purpose statement in itself sets the stage for effective evaluation, because it gives you basically the look-fors. We're looking for, how are we influencing long-term viability in terms of managing the school's resources? You can go straight to hard data like the finances of the school and start looking at, your slush funds and your capital development funds, and how sustainable are we? Can we suffer a stress of a financial world financial catastrophe again? Or how are we going to be affected if 3 new schools build right down the road from us? How can we weather this? And we look at, how do we act as a board? You see that part in blue that really comes about the value-driven aspects of it as well, which is, we will think, I'm sorry, the how aspects of it, which was we'll think individually and act collectively. You can measure that. That's a very easy thing to measure, just in terms of looking at your debate processes, decision-making processes. And lastly, we focus on the what, focusing on big picture and managing boundaries and monitoring performance. Again, you can break that statement down into very easy, measurable, and transparent data sources that will inform you whether or not you're living by your mission. I think it's also important to note that Jim Collins, who inspired all of that, he once noted that you absolutely do not need to be in a great industry to produce sustained great results. No matter how bad the industry, every good to great company figured out how to produce truly superior economic returns. Now, for a school, I know we're not concerned about economic returns, but we do want to be economically viable. And it's fair to say that in this hyper-competitive industry now, that we are concerned about that bottom line, because guess what that bottom line impacts? It impacts programs. You need a critical mass of students to be able to offer the programs that truly enrich learning. And to do that, you need to be able to, you need to differentiate, you need to do so many things that are influenced at the board level, not only from stewards of the financial health of the organization, but in terms of long-term planning. So that's why it's important, and why I wanted to focus on that. Next, when we think about board performance, these are my beliefs, and these beliefs about effective governance are also reinforced in the various governance manuals for independent schools, accreditation bodies. But at the heart of it, we need to really focus on the responsibilities of the board. And what are the core responsibilities? Well, they need to hire a fit head of school. That fit head of school, that word fit means culturally fit. That means it's a head of school that is aligned with the values and mission of the school, that can help that school pursue and achieve the vision and the mission. That their values are also tightly aligned, and that they themselves are going to be there to see through that strategic plan that the board is going to approve and be a part of putting in place. So the board is in part going to be evaluated based on the head of school. Hey, did we choose a good head of school? That's a question you need to ask yourself. Did we choose the right head of school? And you determine this through the evaluation of the head of school. So they're complementary. Next, we're looking at the partnership between management and the board, a very important metric in terms of looking at board performance. How is that relationship, and how do you measure it? There's quite a few ways to measure that. And again, it's going to be looking at key performance metrics. It's going to be looking at staff satisfaction surveys. It's going to be looking at effectively reporting mechanisms between management and the board. Focus on big picture. Again, hey, when we take a look at our minutes for our board meetings over the course of a year, and so you might have 6 or 10 meetings, are those agendas focused on big picture items, or are we starting to look at teacher evaluation? If teacher evaluation or something's popping up into the board minutes that are more about the process and the organ or the work of the school or management, then we have a little bit of a concern. If it's about holistically, hey, how do we use evaluation within our culture of a school? That's a different conversation. So we need to be looking at those agenda items when we reflect over the year. Did we focus on big picture? Lastly, monitoring performance. It kind of saddens me sometimes when I go into and observe a board meeting, and an hour to 2 hours of a board meeting can be focused on where the students are going to college, or where did they get accepted to, and everybody glad hands themselves saying, yeah, we got 3 into Stanford, 2 into Yale. For me, that's not a key performance metric. We should be looking at many others, and I'll be going into those as we move through today's slides. If you can get me to the next slide. Another important thing, not Nolan's, if we can go back to, there we go. Another thing about board evaluation that I want to allay people's concerns about is, elected versus self-perpetuating, not-for-profit versus for-profit. At the end of the day, board evaluation practices, many of which that I've adopted from corporate practice, best corporate practice, is going to work across the board. Some things I see, though, in terms of board evaluation, I find that elected boards might more regularly update their documentation and be subjected to more regular review, only because they have people constantly coming into the board, asking questions. Hey, where do I find that? What's the process for this? And as they do that, it gets other people thinking, oh yeah, where is that information? So they're constantly finding it, refreshing it, and kind of putting it out in front of people. Now, depending on how well it's managed, will determine whether or not when the next people come onto the board, whether they're asking the same questions. Self-perpetuating boards, though, I'm a big fan of self-perpetuating boards only because I'm a huge advocate of long-term strategy. And self-perpetuating boards generally have the capacity and capability to engage in and see through strategic planning. But a certain complacency can be built into the fact that these governors get really focused in terms of the operations of the work of the school, and they don't zoom out enough just to look at their own performance. And by doing that, they themselves are robbing themselves of the opportunity to debrief their ability to monitor and evaluate how are they performing relative to the strategic plan they've put in place. So this is something that, again, we got to be cognizant of, but both generally don't engage in, I'd say, meaningful or regular evaluation. I see we did get a comment up here about Nanjing International School. We do a self-evaluation annually. That's great when we're asking questions. And to be honest, sometimes when I look at the most simple evaluation, it's asking 3 questions. What are we doing well? What do we need to what can we do more of? And lastly, what should be our focus? So just kind of put that out there again. And Paul, maybe you can type those in for me, but what are we doing well? What do we need to be doing more of? And what should be our focus? Just that in itself can be a very effective form of self-evaluation. Now, as we begin to move further into this evaluative process, I want to start talking about the look-fors. And this look-fors is also going to be, combined with looking at not just what those look-fors are, but what stakeholders might be expecting from us. A good place to start is Nolan's principles. Now, Sir Nolan, or Lord Nolan, in the UK back in the 90s, the UK was suffering a problem where many people were quite unhappy with public governance. Lord Nolan convened a committee to talk about, hey, what is effective committee or effective governance, and what are some recommendations we can do to improve the standards of governance across the public sector, and this includes education. From that committee and the work that they did over the years that they were combined, Nolan's principles were basically distilled down to this. Good governance is, selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. When we reflect on those look-fors, now again, if you're beholden to maybe a UK accrediting body that might be influenced by Nolan's principles, this is what that body is looking for. They're looking for, hey, is this school, how do they rate based on these characteristics for good governance? And, the best thing that came out in Nolan's committee was the fact that they were also able to identify how to practice accountability, integrity, and leadership. So they were able to take these from, this sort of higher level concept of principles and values and character attributes to actually saying, hey, if you are accountable, if you do have integrity, if you are demonstrating good leadership, you are doing such things as you have a strategic plan in place, you're spending money wisely, and you're fulfilling the needs of your learners. So they were able to distill these character attributes into actual tangible actions that can be observed and evaluated. So if you're at the stage, at this higher level of looking at what character attributes are going to inform us in terms of our performance evaluations, then you need to have the conversation about what demonstrates these character attributes. Hey, Paul, how am I doing? Am I not talking too fast, am I?
No, you're doing fine.
All
Keep
right.
it going.
Great, great. You know, another area that I'm quite familiar with, obviously, is the Council of International Schools. And when we look at accrediting bodies, you know, we're looking at, you know, for the 8th edition for the COIS accreditation body, there's really only 2 that are influenced by evaluation, that they want to know that the board is engaging in these processes. And, you know, not to be unfair to CIS, but they don't really push schools hard enough to demonstrate that form of evaluation or to take it deeper. They're satisfied with the fact that a board can report on the fact of C1C or C4E, that, you know, there's measures that they're effectively measuring the school's success in putting its mission's objectives into practice. So there has to be some way for the board to demonstrate that they're aware of how the school is performing. When we take a look at C4E, that there's policies and practices include regular and systematic appraisal of its governance organization. So just being aware of this and being able to talk about being able to do a self-evaluation every year is enough to satisfy CIS. And the next question is, would CIS push you to say, hey, show us an example of what that evaluation looks like? Often I don't see that in the CIS reports. So again, it kind of leaves you wondering, you know, is what we're doing enough, or could we be doing more? I like to think if you want to go from good to great, you should always be asking the question, can we do more? And what can we do better? You know, and when I further move into this and we look at regulatory reasons, you know, I'm based in Hong Kong. And for those that look at evaluation as a regulatory requirement for reporting, you know, the EDB in Hong Kong is really quite simple. Here, if you go through their website and their policy requirements, you'll see that it simply boils down to that there's a school annual report to be submitted to the school management committee. The SMC, by the way, is actually a very important critical component of Hong Kong's policies and requirements of schools in Hong Kong, that they have this specially formed school management committee that they do go and define quite extensively. But as far as the evaluation goes, they just want to make sure that there's a school annual report submitted to the SMC or the Incorporated Management Committee for endorsement and then uploaded onto a school's website. They just want to make sure that the board is actually producing something that's transparent, communicates to the community about how they think the school is doing. And the EDB even gives an example of what that report looks like, which in itself, in order to do this report, is a form of evaluation. You know, it's presenting our school, you know, who are we, what are our achievements and reflections on major concerns. So you need to obviously go out into the community and get that information. You know, what's our learning and teaching like? What's our support for student development, and so on and so forth. All of these are informations that you can get from various data sources and community members. But
Michael, before we continue,
Yep.
I have a question regarding transparency. It's a trust and transparency we've talked about in the past, and it's a very hot topic right now. With schools doing evaluations and potentially sort of sharing that information with the regulators or accreditators, but also seeking information from their stakeholders, what do you think the sort of feedback loop should be with the sort of wider stakeholder group in terms of sharing information about their own evaluation? Is it something that could be presented as AGM, or something that could be emailed to people saying, I'm not saying like getting into the deeper detail, but at least suggesting to people that we have been evaluating and this is what we found? Yeah. Is that something you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of schools do a really good job on their annual reports that I've worked with and I see. Some could do better, but, and this is particularly, again, in that Hong Kong context. where they do go into those details. But again, some of those annual reports kind of leave people wondering more about what the board's role. The board in itself will review and add to and contribute to those reports, but often in those reports, they don't talk enough about themselves. They focus everything on the school. And that's probably the most critical stakeholder. In terms of reporting on other stakeholder information and data, there's excellent ways to do that in terms of just reporting the source of the information. So achievements and reflection on major concerns, for instance, that's a great opportunity to celebrate things that are going on in the community from where we're getting input from. But reflection on major concerns, that's an opportunity to share that, hey, you know what, throughout the year, we heard from a number of parents or staff about X concern or consideration, whether it be like staff benefits or, unfortunately, if I want to hit something close to home, there was a really tragic bus accident that happened here in Hong Kong about a bus that just was not parked properly, I believe it was a fatality, but it created quite an uproar. And that, in that time, parents were acting very quickly to it and really wanting to understand better about how school buses are managed in there. Those types of incidents, it's an opportunity, number one, to address the fact that, hey, we heard you. Number two, this is the information we got back. And three, this is how we addressed it. And I think that form of evaluation is often missing as well. Because some people, once they've kind of dealt with it, they just want to move on. But when I talk about performance evaluation at every level, we're talking about competency-based behavioral evaluations. How did you react in this particular situation? And I would say boards also have to be held accountable for that. So they should be asking ourselves, hey, what types of major concerns do we have this year? How did we react to it? And more importantly, is that something we can report? Well, I'd like to think if they reacted appropriately and it's something that they can be proud of, but yes, for sure. Did that answer the question?
It does, yeah. And again, we're going to be touching in later webinars and newscasts this year on communicating with stakeholders. And also, I think the important part there, and we'll quickly move on, is about having the appropriate communication channels open to people, so and letting people know exactly how they can communicate with you and how you're going to communicate with them, so expectations are managed. But we'll move on with board evaluations and back to you, Michael.
Yeah, so I mean, here in this slide, I'm going to be moving into stakeholder mapping, and stakeholder mapping is an incredibly important tool when we're engaging in any form of evaluation. You can use this actually in so many different ways, from leading change to strategic planning, to head of school evaluation, who's involved in the process. Well, let's take a look at board evaluation. So who typically gets involved? I would say at the heart of it is management. That relationship between management and board is so incredibly important that management is, they're most privy to the work that the board is doing. They're the ones that are directly impacted by it. So at the center of any board evaluation, we need to take into account management. Next, we take a look at accreditation. Now, accreditation may not be directly involved in this board evaluation, but they're holding schools accountable for it. And accreditation agencies or associations, they provide a framework for evaluation that schools can mimic and mirror, which is good. Now, this might be interesting for some that I put staff a little bit further outside that circle than accreditation, only because in terms of the school's concerns about those 3- and 5-year school visits that come around and, oh no, we got to report, we got to do the self-study. With staff, it's a constant involvement with staff in terms of how are the decisions we're making impacting staff effectiveness and welfare. And so they're a very important operational data source. Lastly, on the outside of the circle is community. They're the pulse of the school. So we need to always be mindful of how the community is reacting to what's going on in the school. Everything from, concerns about health and welfare and safety to overall satisfaction, say, with the maths program. What are the whispers? What type of information are we getting? But anyways, as we kind of move outside the circle as well, again, I don't want to kind of give you that idea that that staff and community are less important. But as we move outside the circle, the sources of data start to become much more disparate as well. And there tends to be a lot more data that we have to start trying to filter and source through. So that's why it's part of a bigger target to try to understand staff and community in terms of evaluation. It's really much it's a bigger target you're focusing on, whereas accreditation and management is much smaller and sometimes more difficult to hone in on. But let's go to the next slide and let's start looking at what this looks like. Stakeholder mapping is about dispositions. What are the dispositions of our various stakeholders? You can see on one axis, we're looking at involvement. On that bottom axis, we're looking at, is that involvement direct or indirect in the evaluation process? If we go to the next slide, I have an example of what that would look like. And here, what I've done is I've just kind of skipped ahead in the process, and I've begun to identify for a particular school I had in mind at this time about their stakeholder influence. And now you can see how when I start to map the dispositions, and we also start to see that the circles for each stakeholder is bigger or smaller, the things I want you to key in on is look where accreditation is compared to staff. Well, staff have a much more direct involvement in the evaluation process because they're much more directly affected by it. Whereas accreditation is a little bit smaller a circle, roughly, maybe, a little bit higher on the involvement scale there, but they're indirectly involved. They're basically, we're responding to their needs for what that accreditation cycle is. Whereas with staff, we have to be mindful of them, constantly. And plus, they're a bigger stakeholder group. In terms of their involvement in the accreditation process, I differentiate accreditation and staff largely by the fact that accreditation standards are very specific. So their involvement is much more specific to the evaluation process, and it's delineated. Whereas with staff, like I said, it's like that big dartboard again, kind of throwing a dart at it and hoping you hit the right information and that you paid attention to the right vital signs for the pulse, including the parents. So you need to be much more directly involved with them to better understand what those needs are and how they're impacted by the work of the board. So on a dispositions map like this, if I was to use this for setting up evaluation, I would know for a fact that I would be weighting the data from the head of school and and that SMC again is talking about the school management committee. I'd probably be waiting and be more involved with those stakeholders in the evaluation process, making sure we got much more direct feedback. But I'd also want to make sure that I get feedback in the form of surveys from parents, administration, and students. Another area that impacts the board in terms of, just an example, could be part-time teachers and suppliers. So, what if you have a school that has a really hard time getting people to do cover? What is it about our school that we can't find the appropriate people to do cover? Why has this become such an issue? Well, let's go look at those stakeholders and try to understand that better. Or suppliers, when we do facility management audits, you'd be surprised, like, hey, we're managing 150 different suppliers when we probably could boil that down to 20. What type of feedback can we be getting from them to help us inform that decision making? So this is an example of how and where and why stakeholders are involved in the process. And when you're doing and creating your evaluation for the board, how you might want to weight and determine where the data is coming from for these different stakeholders and how they're involved. That's a fairly complex concept that I dealt with pretty quickly. Paul, do you think there's any questions that might revolve around that?
Yeah, I would say probably if you were starting out or if you were looking to enhance an existing one, which is a self-evaluation process where you don't really gather any information outside of the board itself, like what would be then, instead of going into this complex process from the get-go, would you just start working with sort of like the groups in the sort of top right, or with the larger bubbles? Which ones would you be focusing more on, the big bubbles of influence, or the ones that have more of a direct involvement? You know, if you had to prioritize.
Yeah, I mean, if I had to prioritize, I'd probably start with management. And management's those two top right bubbles. Only in the fact that, you know, management should have a pulse on the community and should be able to feed data to us to help us inform our performance relative to not only their satisfaction, but to the strategic objectives that we've set forth and how they're impacting the community. So in those top two circles, especially when we have a lot of trust invested in each other, we should be able to depend on the information that is coming to us from that management committee and the head of school, and then use that data to properly inform ourselves. When you have the time and the ability to invest in getting, you know, more, I would say, intimate with your community and stakeholders, it's definitely worth it. Do you have to do it every year? No. But I would say every few years, especially when there's turnover in the board, or we're looking for new board members might be coming in. Just before they come in, let's evaluate how we were doing before that other cohort leaves. You know, it might be a good opportunity just to check in to say, hey, how did we perform relative to this purpose with these stakeholders, and let's get direct information from them. But interestingly enough, there are community surveys that go out every year, and some people get surveyed to death. So again, you probably don't need to do an extensive survey process. I bet that information is there. The question is, how are you using it? And that's the most important thing.
I think that's the thing about asking the right questions at the right time. If you can do an annual survey which covers off information they'll be using for multiple processes, I think that's the best way to go. Shall we move on to sort of some of the information that you want to be gathering?
Yeah, well, you know, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start moving into the board health check-in and sharing an example of what it looked like. So as we kind of look at the board health check, and when I focus on a performance evaluation for the board, I'm looking at 13 key performance categories. These 13 categories are listed there. I'm not gonna read through them for you, but based on these 13 categories, it goes deep. Each category has 12 performance indicators. Those 12 performance indicators, what we're looking to do is we're looking to really better understand how do we perform relative, say, to balanced roles, and how does the chair affect those roles. What we could do is, let me show you an example of what that looks like when a board is performing well. Can you go to the next slide?
Sure.
Here in the next slide, when we talk about the board health check, this is just a small sample of 10 statements that come out of the 156 statements of the board health check. And this is an example of what it looks like when the board is doing well. For this example board, these were their top 10 performing areas. So, you know, at the very top of it was, we do not have an excessively high or disruptive turnover of governors within the board. When we reflect on that, we're looking at morale. Now, the interesting thing, this is saying K8, and I know in the previous slide, actually, now I reflect on it, when the
J, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a J. The funny thing about that is my partner that I did this with, when we did the original board health check, he always used to like to say there's no I in team, so therefore I don't want an I as a category. I've since changed that because it just gets confusing.
Yeah, as excuses go, that's pretty good. But
yeah. But when we take a look at that performance indicator for K8, and you know, what we're looking at is effectively, hey, you know, is there a lot of turnover on the board? Because if there is, that could basically determine that we have low morale. So that's just an example of how these statements are reflective of these performance categories. Even to the extent, you know, even on the lower best performing, I'm not thinking about leaving the board, and I'm likely to do so in the next 12 months. You know, that's an incredibly important engagement question. For those of you that are familiar with staff engagement, that is probably the most important question you can ask your staff, anybody on a team or at your board level, because if they're looking to depart, you know, and this is, we're doing this in a truly authentic manner, and we're protecting people's, you know, doing it in an anonymous manner, it's really important to know what people are thinking about in terms of their future, and is it aligned with that of the organization. But in this particular case, morale is really high on this board. You can see where the K's lie. If we go to the next slide, though, this is where we're going to go deeper into the board health check, because now what we're looking at is a very specific board attribute, and this is change, creativity, and challenging the status quo. And this is an area that I find with many boards where you can get activist board members that are very sensitive about this particular performance category. And the reason that they're particular about this performance category is because, you know, there might be a particular issue that they're very passionate about that they feel the board is acting too conservatively upon. That might have what drawn them to the board, or for whatever reasons at this particular time they feel it's very relevant, and you know, they're not getting traction on it. Let's take a look at M3. M3 in this particular case, the statement that when we take a look at the performance indicator of the white bar versus the blue bar, the white bar would be the chairman of the board, or chairperson, excuse me, and the blue would be the average of the board members. In this particular case, what we were looking for is we actively use a range of creative thinking tools in our discussions and meetings. This is, you know, sending out a very clear message to the chair that, hey, our meetings are not actually, you know, very creative. We're not bringing to the table the tools we need to solve the problems that we're faced with. We're not doing it perhaps in a, or as in logical way, or in as thorough of a way. The best thing about these types of statements now is that this puts the board chair in a position where they have to then ask, all right, guys, you know, I thought, you know, meeting wise, we were doing a pretty good job in terms of being creative, but you're saying we're not, or we're not doing as well a job as I think we are. What are you thinking, or what experiences do you have that informed you on this particular point? And that's where, you know, people could say that, you know, in our meetings, we have a board of 16 people, and usually when it comes to certain issues, there's only 3 or 4 people actually contributing to it, and the rest of us kind of get crowded out, or we're not using protocols to ensure that we're getting involvement and engagement from other board members, and you know, some just don't want to engage in that battle. They want to choose their battles, so they might withdraw. That could be some of the thinking that leads to the fact that they don't feel they're being creative enough because they're not really brainstorming enough. They might move through agenda items too quickly. There's a number of reasons why people might think that. But when you do the board health check and you look at that data, what's going to come from it is the fact that you're now having a discussion around how people and why people rated it that way. And now that informs the board chair in terms of their facilitation practice of the meetings, and how they might be able to add more tools to it.
I think what I like about this is the depth of the information you'd be getting. You know, obviously we're not going to be going into all the different 12 questions or data points that you're gathering in these 13 categories, you know, 156 data points. You know, people can probably, if they want to, create them themselves, or get in touch with us to get access to that one. But what I also believe, like, again, if a high performing board is doing well, it's got a risk register, and this information, this board evaluation, the stuff you're getting back is actually informing the risk register as well. It's informing not just have we identified all the risks, but also identifying the probability of this risk actually eventuating, especially these more internal risks rather than the external risks, which may be outside of the control of the board. But these are the ones which are in control, that the board has some sort of control over. And it's a great way of informing how high up the priority list this risk goes. So again, if a risk register is sort of the performance of the board, like again, just picking one from the air, like, you know, the overarching performance of the board, or the relationship between the chair and the rest of the board, the example you've just described will say that's actually a high probability risk, and then we should put steps in place to actually address that risk. Yeah. So I love the way this is actually blending and feeding through to lots of different aspects of high performing board.
Yeah. And the most important thing about evaluation in this particular case is the tool itself is an excuse to have the important conversations. The tool itself, like the one thing I love about accreditation reporting is that it's forcing schools to ask the questions every 3 to 5 years that they would ordinarily just forget to ask because they're just so busy. So the evaluation process is more like a prompt, just like the accreditation process. It's that opportunity for reflection. And when you do that, you start to narrow down, like you said with the risk register, you can start focusing on the more important conversations you need to have. And more importantly, this is objective data. So we can actually agree on the fact that, yeah, maybe it's more important that we talk about creativity in the boardroom than we talk about morale, because the morale issue might just involve one person, whereas creativity in the room affects the majority of the people. And this also is an opportunity for board members to realize and respect that the concerns they have compared to those of the rest of the board may not be as high on that priority list, so they're going to have to let go. So it sends a clear message that, hey, if morale is something that you have a problem with, but the board itself rated it very high, then you probably have to let go from that and focus more on what the board is concerned about.
And look, it can be very tricky for a board to have that internal discussion if there isn't that, going back to Nolan's principles, if there isn't that element of openness and accountability. And again, it goes back to why those principles are so important when you are creating your board, when you are recruiting for your board, and when you're actually like developing that environment, that culture, is the openness, accountability. So you can have these honest conversations. And if you're struggling with that, then it's always good to bring in a third-party facilitator.
Yeah.
Do you want to take us through like a live case study that you did with the Chinese International School?
Yeah. Now, the Chinese International School is a great case to talk about, and one that I can talk about in pretty good detail, because this is something that they allowed me to talk about publicly. They gave me a letter of reference, and what I'll do is I'm gonna talk about this case through the lens of what they would be comfortable with me talking about, in so much as what they've publicly commented on.
Before you carry on, I'm just going to let people know we're looking at probably about another 5-10 minutes for the webinar, just so people can know how long they've got left.
All right, perfect. So this will be about 5 minutes, and in that case, the board health check in terms of the Chinese International School, I'm always looking at 3 areas. Number one, I'm doing a full documentation audit. I want to look at the articles of association or the memoranda. I want to look at the governance handbook. I want to look at the agendas for the past 3 years. I want to look at a strategic plan. I want to look at accreditation reports. I want to look at their, when it comes to any sort of evaluatory document they had, or any consultancy reports they've had over the last 3 years. I want to go deep. The more deep that you can allow me to go, the greater the context I'll have in terms of what I can provide in terms of, number one, often what I see is that a lot of the documentation seems to be spread out all over the place. And the reason why people joining the board always have these questions is because no one else knows where to find it, even though it might be there in front of them. So often what I do is I say, look, let's just organize your documentation. So first and foremost, this is important stuff, but let's make sure it's organized in such a way that people can access it. Number two, let's get an understanding and idea about how it's managed. So, before I start going into what that information is telling me, I'm really looking at how that information is managed, because for me, it's about managing information so that governors can access it and govern effectively. The actual data in that information is secondary to me at this point in the process. So in this particular case, what I'm doing is not only am I getting my context, but I'm also getting a really good insight in terms of what the board is focusing on and the types of messages they've had shared with them. When I look at the agendas, and I look at agendas over the last 3 years and I start to see the same things repeating year after year after year, I start to ask myself, why have they not addressed this? Why is it a repeating topic? Or if it's not a repeating topic, how come they haven't changed the way that they're actually talking about it? And sometimes when I come in on the board health check, just by providing that perspective, saying, guys, we need to change the narrative about the school land acquisition policy. for schools that are looking to get more land. Instead of saying, you know, land acquisition year 1, year 2, and year 3, let's try to be more specific about what we want to achieve in that terms of land acquisition, and let's try to get more to the heart of it. What have we learned up to this point? Let's change that narrative, and let's make sure if it goes on the agenda again, we're more specific about what we want to achieve. So this is, you know, another way I go deep into the documentation and help schools better understand the way they're communicating. And then next, you'll notice that between the articles of association, maybe regulatory requirements from the government, as well as the governance handbook, there could be a lot of conforming changes that need to be made, meaning that we could look at the regulations and the articles that are on file, and we look at that sort of, are they up to date? If there's been a number of changes and additions to the memoranda, you know, are those appendices, are they visible? Do we understand how they influence the governance handbook per se? And has the governance handbook been updated? Often changes to memoranda and the governance handbook don't happen side by side. One is a reaction to something, and then the other is basically because, well, they're both reactions because the next person asks, hey, is this still relevant? And then they go back and they make those conforming changes. So it's good to have somebody on the board that's, you know, responsible for and managing that data. The second part of the evaluation then goes into stakeholder interviews. And, you know, we'll do a stakeholder mapping. We'll try to identify, you know, whose data and information is going to influence the board greatest. Normally, my stakeholder interviews at this stage are just related to the board, perhaps some people in management. And at that particular time, what I'm trying to do is get an idea around my 3 questions. Hey, what are you doing well? What do you need to be doing more of? And number 3, what needs to be your focus? And often the board health check, when I do that, what I find is that the answers to those questions are answers that people hold to themselves. They never share with each other what they think they're doing good. They never share with each other what they think they need to be doing more of. So that's the low-hanging fruit for me to do this. I come in, I ask those questions. Out of 16 people, I find 12 people feel that they need to be focusing more on a particular issue, or they need to be, you know, removing themselves more from the day-to-day and focusing on big picture. Maybe they bring up strategic planning. And then right off the bat, the board health check, what it's yielded me is it's yielded me to the first action point. Well, I know 12 out of 16 people want to do a strategic plan. So if I focus on that, this is going to be a very effective evaluation. And I don't mean to to patronize my process, but those are conversations that I feel that, you know, if people are having regularly, it will help them narrow the focus of where the evaluation needs to be. So now let's focus on the board health check itself. And the third is the tool that I demonstrated for you in the last couple of slides. Let's go deep now and start looking at how the board is performing relative to what our focus needs to be. For the board health check to be effective, it can't just be a general evaluation on these principles. I like to focus deeply in terms of a purpose or a mission. I like to focus into what is the purpose of our board and how are we performing relative to it. So when we talk about thinking creatively, I don't want to talk about thinking creatively across all of our meetings. I want to think and evaluate based on how are we creatively thinking around our purpose or our goal. The more focused we can actually make the intent of the evaluation, not only the more reliable, but the more beneficial the data that we yield from it will be. You can do the board health check in a more generalized fashion about general board evaluation performance. But that's much more difficult people to grasp their heads around. And often the complaint is, I don't understand how this applies to us. I can't see the relevancy. Well, in fact, if you're a team, all 156 performance indicators are relative of any team. And if you don't feel it's that particular indicator is relative to you as a team, it's because you're not addressing it as a team. You're not seeing yourself as a team in that particular context. Therefore, it should actually be rated much lower. And so that's why you want to make sure these are purpose-driven. Everything you do needs to be purpose-driven. The evaluation needs to be designed with the purpose in mind. The board health check needs to be taken with the purpose in mind. When I talk about the document exploration and auditing and the stakeholder interviews, it needs to be purpose-driven. You know, where do I want to probe? Where do I want to get more deep and rich information so that we can identify actions for growth? And with the Chinese International School, what came out of this process was that we were able to help them focus more in areas that were really pertinent to them. In two areas that this was really important was that they had just experienced quite a few board members joining over the last few years. This is a self-perpetuating board. For them to have had somewhere between 5 to 8 new board members joining, that's a huge shift. They had also recently changed their board chair, and they were also going through a leadership change. New head of school is coming on board. I believe the primary and the secondary principals as well were rotating out. And so at this particular time, a lot of the new board members said, hey, while we're in this sort of period of waiting for the new leadership to come into place, and before we engage in our strategic planning process, let's do an evaluation of ourselves. And let's see how we're performing relative to that evaluation and how that can influence our relationship with our new leaders and with the strategic plan. So there was a very specific purpose. And that made actually the evaluation very positive because it guided the discussions with the stakeholders. In terms of the data that was yielded from the board health check, we were able to focus on areas that were very critical to the board's interpersonal relationships as well as its intergroup relationships. Some examples of recommendations that came out of it was actually getting the board chair to be more personal with the board members, getting the board to actually communicate more transparently with the community, so that they would be in a position where they were seen more as a positive influence for change as opposed to this ominous sort of group of people that many people didn't know. So the board health check, what came out of it is they became more personable and transparent in terms of their activities and relationships. And the process itself, just by engaging those conversations, probably had more of an impact than the actual, I should say this, but in terms of the actual tools and the processes that I brought to bear.
And again, it's interesting that you mentioned the transparency word, and it's probably building more trust. And again, we talk about communication with stakeholders, the whole process in itself, yes, the outcomes and what happens, the process of actually going through that audit and engaging people and gathering information is a wonderful stakeholder exercise in itself, let alone the information you actually get from it. Obviously, that's the important part is what you do with that information. It sounds like the school took it on and made some amazing changes as well. At this point, I'd like to see if there's any questions as we come towards the end of the webinar. We haven't really got any more slides left apart from just something to let you know about what's coming up. But are there any questions? As Michael goes into a summary, I'd love to see if there's any questions coming about for any part of this presentation or this case study, whatever it happens to be. And Michael, I'll take you to your final slide, which sort of just brings up a bit of a summary.
Yeah, I mean, largely what we're talking about here is why conduct the board health checks. It's effective governance. It all comes down to effective governance. And we need to be evaluating our processes and how we measure ourselves to that mission, not only because of what our stakeholders' expectations are of ourselves, but also if we want to be great, we need to always be identifying how we can improve. And that's just as true for the board as it is for, I said, like your grade 7 team. So, why? We should always be looking to improve, and there's always places to improve. What should be evaluated? This comes down to our stakeholders, what the look-fors are. What are those stakeholders looking for? What is management looking for from us? What are the parents looking for from us? How do we weight those look-fors relative to our evaluation process? And then as we design our evaluation process with those look-fors in mind, we need to keep in mind that, hey, we already survey our parents and our staff a lot. So what can we be gathering from what we already have to inform us in terms of that? And if what we're looking for is not included in those surveys, well, hey, let's next year make sure we update them so that they do. Next is when we actually conduct that evaluation, let's be mindful of not just our relationships and the decisions we're making, Well, let's look about how we're documenting and the transparency of the work that we do. Let's take a look at, just even the simple organizational aspects of it. Is subcommittee X still necessary? One of the subcommittees that I'm most critical about is an education subcommittee or a curriculum subcommittee or a teachers subcommittee. I've seen them all. And again, I have to ask, hey, is that related more to management or to governance? And let's take a look at the history of why we had that subcommittee. Let's reflect on that history, and then let's decide if it's still relevant. And if so, let's make sure that the purpose of that committee is. So again, board evaluation is also about organization. And so how do you use these results? Well, you engage in it every year. You identify action items for how you can improve in the next year. It could be meeting management. Hey, our meetings are 5 hours long. How do we break it down to three hours? That itself is a very pertinent question that can guide evaluation very effectively. And then when you do those board health checks, the board health check tool, if it's based on the fact that we want to go from a 5-hour meeting to a 3-hour meeting, people are going to be very specific about their feedback in those 13 categories. And that will yield the information you need to understand how to better manage and facilitate those meetings. So that's how you basically use those results. Is you want to come back to what the purpose of your board is at that particular given time. Establish that purpose going into your new year, and ensure that the action items you identified from the year before are being consciously implemented. And in a sense, that's improvement.
And I think the other thing about this as well, if you can be relatively consistent with what you're asking, so let's say they're using the 156 point system or variation of that, or they've created their own based on a number of categories they've got. If you can be consistent in the way that you are marking yourself, scoring yourself, and gathering information, you can actually track your progress. So for example, if we go back to this slide here, let's say that over the years, you've been really conscious of high turnover, and you scored 5 years ago, you scored down in 4 or 5, and you said, right, we really want this this turnover, this disruption to lessen, and here we go, this is our result. I'm not suggesting you can set targets of scores, although that's the ultimate aim potentially, but you can at least track and look for improvements in those key areas. And this is where doing this consistently on an annual basis and using the same tools, whether you've created them yourselves or you're using a third-party tools, is so important.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say to that as well is that I've basically introduced a very sophisticated and involved process, and I'm not advocating that you do that every year. But if you know what you're looking for and you already have in place where that data can be yielded without having to ask others to actively contribute it again, it's just a matter of being able to bring it together every year at some point through some subcommittee that basically collects that information, prepares the report based on what's important for us to report on, and it's there in front of you to have a discussion. What are we doing well? What do we need to do more of? And where can we improve? And then maybe every 2 or 3 years, you engage yourself in a much more sophisticated process.
Look, there hasn't been any questions come through as yet, so that probably means either that it's extremely comprehensive or people just need a bit of time to reflect. So questions may come through later on when people have a chance to review this or and watch it back and just go back through that sort of stuff. And so we welcome questions at any time. Again, you can come through various points to communicate with us. The LinkedIn group is a great way to engage with us and find Michael and myself as well. So we'll welcome your questions if you have any questions that come after this. Just to wrap up, because we've just slightly gone over time, we just want to talk about what's coming up for you as well.
Yeah. And because this was such a successful webinar in terms of people that were interested in it, and in terms of the types of inquiries I've gotten over the last year, probably more because I've talked more about it, especially through LinkedIn as well, that March 9th, we're going to be doing a workshop on board health checks in Hong Kong, half-day workshop. You can find the link for it here at the bottom of that slide. You can join via video through Zoom. or you can join in person live. And what we're going to be doing on that day is I will engage you and coach you through the stakeholder mapping process. So it's highly recommended that you join with a colleague. I will engage you through the process of the look-fors, helping you understand through who your accrediting bodies are, as well as any other associations or stakeholders that you're interested in, and understanding what the look-fors are from them. So defining that, because that becomes our criteria. We'll be then identifying what the main categories for evaluation are that you need to focus on. And then finally, I'll be letting you take the board health check tool. You'll be taking those 156 indicators. You'll be getting a report based on those 156 indicators that will help you be able to better understand and reflect on where you need to be focusing. What are the things you need to be celebrating as a board, and where are the areas that you believe that the board could focus on more? Now, of course, the more people that contribute to the board health check, the power of it in terms of buy-in and being able to better understand the full perception of all board members is actually much more powerful. But even taking it with a few people will help you better be able to reflect on performance indicator criteria, as well as organize your own thoughts for making your own arguments for a more substantive board health check.
Fantastic, Michael. And again, people can follow that link. And as I said, it's in Hong Kong live, but we're going to be opening up to video, so you can actually observe and engage via video as well, wherever you are in the world. So again, we're trying to open this up to a much wider audience by using technology, which is at our disposal. Well, look, thank you, Michael, for that fantastic presentation. Thank you, everybody, for taking part today, whether you're listening live, and so many of you are, or you're listening back to this in recording because you couldn't do it at this time of day. And as I said, please check out the School Governance Network LinkedIn group. Please also check out the YouTube channel, where all of our back history of webinars and newscasts are. And again, the LinkedIn group is a constantly updated place for amazing content. Thank you, Nicole. I got a message through Nicole. Thanks for this presentation. It's certainly given me lots to consider and think about, which is fantastic. Thank you for everybody taking part.
And Julia as well as saying, just for contributing earlier about Nanjing International School.
Thanks, everybody. That's awesome. We look forward to the next one.
All right, guys. Have a great day, and a great for those in China. Gong Xi Fa Cai, Keng Hei Fat Choi. Bye bye.